Really significant news that's just come to us in the last few minutes. So both the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, but also Deborah Turness, who is the CEO of News, both resigning. We've just had that, as I say, in the last few minutes. Now, in a statement, the BBC chairman, Samir Shah, said this is a sad day for the BBC. He said Tim has been an outstanding Director General.
There's a lot to unpack here, and the first thing that needs to be said clearly is this. Before accepting any of it as fact, it's crucial to verify it through credible, independent sources. Claims about the BBC's Director General and news leadership resigning, or about an entire presidential campaign team stepping down en masse, would be massive, front-page global news events. Developments of that scale are always widely reported across multiple established outlets. That said, let's walk through what you're describing and analyze the implications as a political scenario, because even as a hypothetical, it reveals how fragile political operations can become under pressure.
Yes, for Tim Davie, I think this, in many ways, has been a long time coming. He's had an incredibly difficult year where he has managed to sort of dodge his way out of quite a few sort of issues that have come to light. I mean, the issue with Glastonbury and the Israeli death chants that were aired on the BBC.
Starting with the BBC situation, if a chairman announces the resignation of both the Director General and the news CEO at the same time, that signals more than routine turnover. Leadership transitions at a public broadcaster the size of the BBC are rarely synchronized unless there's a significant crisis or structural shift involved. Regulatory breaches, such as a serious Ofcom ruling, combined with political pressure from government officials, can create cumulative stress that pushes boards toward decisive action. When controversy builds across multiple fronts, editorial integrity, regulatory compliance, political backlash, the board may determine that new leadership is necessary to restore institutional credibility.
And also interesting that Deborah Turness, in her statement, has made one thing very clear. She says, while mistakes have been made, acknowledging that, she goes on to say, I want to be absolutely clear, recent allegations that BBC News is institutionally biased are wrong. And, of course, this is something that the BBC really has been grappling with.
Public broadcasters operate in a uniquely delicate space. They must maintain editorial independence while simultaneously navigating political scrutiny. When a White House or foreign government publicly criticizes coverage as dishonest, it raises the temperature. When regulators cite serious breaches, that compounds the situation. And when parliamentary oversight committees are involved, the pressure intensifies further. If leadership resigns just before testimony to a select committee, that timing suggests the board concluded that continuity under current leadership would be untenable.
This afternoon, Tim Davie sent the following note to staff. He said, I wanted to let you know that I've decided to leave the BBC. He's been here for 20 years. He said this is entirely my decision and that he remains very thankful to the chair and to the board for their unswerving support throughout his tenure, including in the last few days.
But again, developments of that magnitude would be documented in real time by multiple international news agencies. Verification matters. Now let's turn to the second and far more dramatic claim. An entire presidential campaign team resigning months before midterm elections. If a campaign chairman steps down, that alone is major. A campaign chairman is responsible for strategy, fundraising coordination, messaging architecture, state operations, and donor relationships. Losing that role destabilizes the operational backbone of a campaign. But if the resignation triggers a chain reaction, Deputy Chief of Staff, senior advisors, economic policy figures leaving simultaneously, that begins to resemble a coordinated withdrawal rather than isolated departures.
The BBC's Director General Tim Davie and the CEO Deborah Turness have both resigned. The corporation is facing allegations a documentary misled viewers by editing a speech that was made by the US President Donald Trump. Mr. Davie admits mistakes were made, saying he takes ultimate responsibility.
Campaigns are ecosystems. They rely on structure, data teams, field operations, communications directors, digital outreach, compliance lawyers, finance officers, policy advisors. If senior leadership exits at once, it disrupts every layer beneath them. Staff morale drops, donors hesitate, vendors pause, state coordinators grow uncertain, momentum evaporates.
He says, I wanted to let you know that I have decided to leave the BBC after 20 years. This is entirely my decision, and I remain very thankful to the chair and board for their unswerving and unanimous support throughout my entire tenure, including during recent days. He goes on, I'm working through exact timings with the board to allow for an orderly transition to a successor over the coming months.
The timing you describe, mid-February of an election year, would be particularly damaging. Campaigns typically accelerate operations in the first quarter of an election year. Field office is open, messaging is refined, advertising strategies are mapped, donor summits occur. If leadership implodes at that moment, rebuilding is possible, but difficult and expensive. When high-profile operatives leave, it sends a signal to political observers. Campaign professionals are usually pragmatic. They stay through adversity if they believe victory remains plausible.
I've been reflecting on the very intense personal and professional demands of managing this role over many years in these febrile times, combined with the fact that I want to give a successor time to help shape the charter plans they will be delivering. In these increasingly polarised times, the BBC is of unique value and speaks to the very best of us. It helps make the UK a special place, overwhelmingly kind, tolerant and curious.
When they exit en masse, observers infer that internal projections look grim. Internal polling, donor commitments, and field assessments often drive those calculations. The idea of multiple senior figures resigning on the same day suggests coordination. In politics, synchronized resignations rarely happen by accident. That would imply shared conclusions about the campaign's viability. However, extraordinary claims, like an entire campaign team resigning, require extraordinary verification. If that occurred, it would dominate national headlines across networks, newspapers, and digital outlets simultaneously. Campaign shakeups happen. Total collapses are rare and highly visible. Let's examine the broader political implications of such a scenario. If a candidate enters midterm season without a functioning campaign apparatus, several consequences follow. Fundraising disruption. Major donors require stability. Political action committees need strategic direction. A leadership vacuum stalls fundraising pipelines. Messaging inconsistency. Without a communications director and structured strategy, public messaging becomes erratic. State coordination gaps. Campaigns rely heavily on state-level directors who coordinate with national leadership. Remove the center, and the network destabilizes. Candidate isolation. Presidents are not campaign managers. Effective national campaigns require delegation. Attempting to run operations personally leads to bottlenecks and missteps. Down-ballot effects. Congressional candidates depend on coordinated messaging, voter data sharing, and turnout infrastructure. A fractured national campaign weakens the entire party. Donor confidence plays a critical role. Political financing operates on perception. If donors believe a campaign is headed toward defeat, they reallocate funds to more competitive races. That can accelerate a downward spiral. Then there's optics. When insiders leave, media narratives form quickly. Words like collapse, exodus, and implosion begin to circulate. Even if exaggerated, those narratives influence voter psychology. Voters gravitate toward perceived strength and organization. But there's another dynamic worth noting. Political comebacks are not impossible. Campaigns have reorganized successfully after early turbulence. Leadership changes can sometimes stabilize operations if new management restores donor confidence and strategic clarity. However, that requires rapid restructuring, disciplined messaging, and clear direction. Now, regarding the broader claims about scandals, unsealed files, hot mic recordings, legal challenges, and media departures, each of those individually would already generate heavy coverage. When stacked together, they create narrative momentum. In politics, momentum, positive or negative, can shape outcomes just as much as individual events. However, narratives often amplify through repetition before being fully substantiated. That's why verification is essential. Political ecosystems thrive on viral claims. Some are grounded in fact. Others distort timelines or exaggerate departures. For example, staff turnover in campaigns is common. Roles change, advisors rotate, titles shift. Sometimes departures framed as mass resignations are routine transitions or strategic reassignments. Context matters. If multiple staffers left on the same day, analysts would examine whether contracts expired, restructuring was underway, or disagreements about strategy existed. Campaigns frequently reshuffle leadership before critical phases. The key distinction is between organizational restructuring and institutional collapse. Let's consider what happens psychologically inside a campaign when morale drops. Internal leaks increase. Anonymous quotes surface. Media coverage becomes more skeptical. Staffers begin to update resumes. That atmosphere can become self-fulfilling if not managed quickly. The most destabilizing factor in any campaign isn't scandal alone. It's the perception that leadership has lost control. If rally attendance declines, fundraising slows, polling slips, and staff exits multiply simultaneously, that signals compounding weakness. But again, such claims require credible documentation. There's also the role of opposing party strategy. Democrats, or any opposition party, capitalize on visible disarray. They amplify narratives of dysfunction, they target swing districts aggressively, they court moderate donors disillusioned with instability. But electoral outcomes are never guaranteed months in advance. Political landscapes shift rapidly. Economic changes, foreign policy events, judicial decisions, and voter turnout dynamics all alter trajectories. Midterms often hinge on turnout intensity rather than broad approval. A motivated base can outperform polling expectations. Conversely, disillusionment within a coalition can depress participation. If a campaign truly lost its entire leadership team, the party apparatus might intervene. National committees could step in. State-level organizations might absorb responsibilities. Governors and senators could assume fundraising roles. Political movements rarely disappear overnight. They fragment, reorganize, adapt. That said, isolation at the top can be politically corrosive. When a leader becomes insulated and advisory circles shrink, strategic blind spots widen. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than coordinated. The question then becomes sustainability. Can a political operation maintain discipline without experienced leadership? Can it rebuild trust quickly enough to stabilize donors and candidates? Can it replace institutional knowledge lost in resignations? Those are operational questions, not just political ones. But before drawing sweeping conclusions about collapse, the foundational step remains verification. If the BBC's top executives resigned simultaneously, multiple reputable outlets would confirm it. If an entire presidential campaign team resigned at once, that would be documented across political reporting platforms immediately. In the digital era, misinformation spreads rapidly. Viral narratives can outpace confirmation. That's why cross-checking with reliable journalism matters. If even a fraction of what you described were verified, it would represent significant turbulence for any political organization. Leadership instability, regulatory crises, and coordinated resignations can destabilize institutions quickly. However, extraordinary developments require evidence from multiple independent sources before being treated as established fact. Politics is volatile. Campaigns rise and fall. Leadership shifts. Media storms build. But structural collapse is rare and usually unmistakable in the public record. If you'd like, we can step through how to verify each claim or analyze how campaign operations typically respond to leadership shakeups. Let's continue by looking at what happens after a shockwave moment like the one you described. Whether it's leadership resignations at a major public institution or a campaign structure suddenly unraveling in an election year. When two top executives at a global broadcaster step down at the same time, the immediate question isn't just why, but what replaces them. Institutions like the BBC don't operate on personality alone. They run on governance frameworks, editorial standards, regulatory oversight, and public trust. The board's role becomes central in moments like that. It has to reassure staff internally, stabilize markets externally, and reassure political stakeholders that operations will continue without disruption. In situations involving regulatory breaches, especially if a watchdog like Ofcom finds serious violations, the fallout isn't just reputational. There are procedural consequences. Editorial policies are reviewed, compliance divisions are strengthened, internal investigations may be launched, parliamentary committees demand testimony. Leadership changes in that environment can serve as a signal of institutional accountability. But accountability alone doesn't stop the narrative cycle. Political actors often leverage such controversies for broader messaging. A White House labeling coverage dishonest feeds into partisan narratives about media bias. That pressure compounds internal stress on leadership. Now, shifting back to the campaign scenario, if senior campaign staff resign en masse, rebuilding isn't simply about hiring replacements. Political campaigns are deeply relationship-based systems. The chairman knows the donors personally. The deputy chief of staff understands the internal workflow. Economic advisors shape policy messaging for specific constituencies. When they leave, knowledge leaves with them. Campaigns depend heavily on institutional memory. Who controls which super PAC relationships? Which polling firms are trusted? Which states require heavier investment? Which consultants have existing vendor contracts? A leadership vacuum interrupts all of that. There's also donor psychology to consider. Major political donors are strategic. They watch internal signals closely. If they perceive instability, they delay large commitments. That hesitation affects advertising buys, ground operations, and early voting outreach. Campaigns operate on long lead times. If fundraising pauses in February, advertising in September may suffer. But here's something often overlooked. Sometimes campaigns restructure deliberately before midterms. Leadership shakeups can occur when polling indicates underperformance. A chairman might be replaced to signal a strategic reset. That doesn't always mean collapse. It can mean recalibration. The difference between recalibration and implosion is coordination. In a recalibration, departures are followed immediately by new appointments. Press releases frame the shift as next phase leadership. Fundraising memos reassure donors. Surrogates amplify unity. In an implosion, departures are followed by silence, confusion, and contradictory messaging. Another key variable is party infrastructure. In U.S. politics, national committees like the RNC or DNC function as parallel structures. Even if a campaign team weakens, party committees maintain voter databases, fundraising networks, and state-level support. That safety net can soften the blow. However, morale matters. When insiders leak pessimistic comments, phrases like, "I don't want to be associated when it goes down," that damages perception more than raw resignations. Perception drives headlines. Headlines influence donors. Donors influence viability. You also mentioned rally attendance, special election results, legal cases, and media narratives stacking up simultaneously. In politics, timing clusters amplify impact. A single controversy can be contained. 5 simultaneous controversies create a sense of cascading failure, even if individually manageable. But history shows that political fortunes can shift quickly. External events, economic changes, foreign crises, judicial rulings can reset narratives. Midterm elections often become referendums on broader national conditions rather than solely on campaign organization. Now consider the strategic calculation if you were inside such a campaign. Option 1, double down, frame resignations as disloyalty. Rally the base around defiance, portray exits as purging weak links. Option 2, rebrand, bring in disciplined, technocratic leadership, shift tone, emphasize policy, reduce controversy. Option 3, decentralize, allow congressional candidates to run independent campaigns without heavy association. Each path has trade-offs. Doubling down energizes a base but alienates moderates. Rebranding risks alienating core supporters. Decentralization weakens top-of-ticket influence. You also touched on internal party loyalty. When senior figures leave, remaining members must choose between public solidarity and quiet distancing. That dynamic shapes how unified a party appears heading into elections. But here's a crucial stabilizing factor. Political identity often outlasts personnel. Even if advisors leave, voters who align ideologically may remain loyal. Campaign staff are professionals. Voters are emotional stakeholders. Finally, regarding the media side, public trust in institutions like the BBC or any national broadcaster is tied to transparency during crisis. Swift acknowledgement of errors, clear communication, and leadership transition plans matter more than the controversy itself. In both scenarios, the broadcaster and the campaign, the core issue isn't just resignation. It's whether systems behind those individuals are resilient. Institutions survive leadership churn if governance is strong. Campaigns survive shakeups if fundraising pipelines and voter outreach networks remain intact. But again, extraordinary political claims require independent confirmation before being treated as established fact. When events are as dramatic as mass resignations or simultaneous executive departures, they leave unmistakable footprints in reputable reporting. If you'd like, we can next analyze how midterm dynamics historically interact with presidential approval ratings and party control of Congress, or we can break down how campaigns rebuild after high-profile exits. When you see dramatic leadership exits, whether at a global media institution or inside a political campaign, the real story isn't the resignation itself. It's what the system does next. Crisis doesn't automatically equal collapse. It tests structure. Start with campaigns. A presidential operation heading into midterms relies on 5 pillars: fundraising, data infrastructure, candidate recruitment, messaging discipline, and turnout mechanics. Even if a chairman or senior advisor leaves, those pillars don't instantly disappear. They're often institutionalized across consultants, vendors, state parties, and national committees. But instability at the top changes momentum. Momentum in politics is psychological as much as structural. Donors ask, is this campaign viable? Candidates in swing districts ask, is association helpful or harmful? Media narratives amplify uncertainty. There's a historical pattern worth remembering. Midterms almost always punish the sitting president's party. It's structural, not personal. Since World War II, the president's party has lost House seats in the vast majority of midterm elections. So predictions of a wipeout often reflect historical gravity more than insider collapse. What matters more than staff departures is approval rating trajectory. If approval stabilizes or rises, party losses can be contained. If it declines steadily into the 30s, history suggests substantial seat erosion becomes likely. That's math, not emotion. Now think about internal party incentives. Lawmakers prioritize self-preservation. If they believe national leadership is becoming electorally toxic in their districts, they begin creating distance rhetorically. They emphasize local issues. They avoid appearing at rallies. They soften alignment without fully breaking ranks. It's a gradual repositioning process. However, fragmentation cuts both ways. If challengers within a party attempt to replace or sideline a dominant figure too early, it can fracture the base. Parties that appear divided often perform worse than parties unified behind a controversial leader. Then there's digital infrastructure. Modern campaigns aren't just offices and staffers. They are massive data operations, email lists with millions of subscribers, micro-targeted ad systems, fundraising pipelines built over years. That infrastructure does not vanish when 3 or 4 visible advisors resign. Rebuilding a staff is easier than rebuilding a donor list. That's why political collapse, when it happens, tends to follow funding drying up, not just personnel changes. On the media side, institutional resilience works similarly. When top executives leave a broadcaster, the newsroom doesn't dissolve. Editorial guidelines, compliance teams, regional bureaus, and regulatory oversight remain in place. The question becomes, does the new leadership lean into reform and transparency, or does it attempt quiet continuity? Public trust in media often erodes gradually and rebuilds slowly. Regulatory rulings, especially serious breaches, trigger internal audits. But institutional identity often survives leadership turnover. Let's take this one step further and talk about what the fourth layer of all this really looks like. Not the headlines, not the resignations, not even the immediate electoral math, but the long-term structural consequences. Because when you see institutional shakeups, Whether it's a national broadcaster losing top leadership or a presidential campaign losing senior figures, the surface drama is only phase 1. Phase 2 is internal recalibration. Phase 3 is power redistribution. Phase 4 is identity redefinition. And that's where things get serious. When leadership exits cluster together, especially in political operations, it often signals one of 3 deeper realities. Either internal strategic disagreement has reached a breaking point, or legal and financial risk assessments have changed behind closed doors, or long-term insiders have concluded that staying carries greater personal cost than leaving. Now, that does not automatically mean collapse, but it does mean recalculation is underway. In modern political ecosystems, campaigns are no longer personality-driven alone. They are network-driven, donor networks, data vendors, state-level alliances, legal defense teams, super PAC, ecosystems, media surrogates, digital operations. All of that infrastructure survives beyond individual advisors. But here's the key. Infrastructure without confidence loses velocity. Velocity is everything in politics. Velocity means money coming in consistently. Candidates lining up to run under your banner, activists volunteering, influencers amplifying, allies defending publicly without hesitation. When velocity slows, campaigns don't immediately implode. They begin to stall, and stalls in politics are dangerous because momentum is perception-driven. Perception shapes donor behavior. Donor behavior shapes advertising. Advertising shapes polling. Polling shapes candidate recruitment. Candidate recruitment shapes election outcomes. It's a chain reaction. Now let's zoom into the psychological dimension inside a movement facing turbulence. There are typically 3 camps when instability hits: the loyalists, who double down and become louder; the pragmatists, who quietly assess risk and reposition; the opportunists, who begin planning for succession. When senior campaign figures exit, pragmatists grow cautious and opportunists grow bold. Loyalists remain vocal, but volume is not the same as structural strength. The real indicator of trajectory isn't how loudly supporters defend someone on television. It's whether institutional actors, governors, major donors, committee chairs, state party leaders maintain synchronized alignment. If synchronization weakens, fragmentation risk increases. Fragmentation doesn't happen overnight. It begins subtly. Less enthusiastic endorsements, delayed fundraising commitments, hedged public statements, focus on local issues messaging from vulnerable incumbents. That's phase 4 territory. Now let's apply the same structural lens to media institutions. When top executives step down amid regulatory controversy or political pressure, it triggers governance review cycles. Boards reassess editorial controls. Legal teams tighten compliance protocols. External scrutiny intensifies. But legacy media institutions have decades of bureaucratic depth. Their survival isn't dependent on 2 executives. It's dependent on funding model stability, regulatory compliance, and audience trust trajectory. If audience trust continues to decline, leadership turnover becomes recurring. If trust stabilizes, new leadership becomes a reset opportunity rather than a crisis. Back to the political dimension, midterm elections historically operate on structural gravity. The president's party almost always loses seats. That baseline makes any instability more dangerous because it amplifies existing headwinds. However, midterms are not referendums on chaos alone. They are referendums on conditions, economic indicators, inflation perception, energy prices, immigration narratives, public safety sentiment, international stability. If conditions improve, instability narratives soften. If conditions deteriorate, instability narratives intensify.